I'm reading from my book, Being Real, A Journey of Discipleship, Chapter 7, The Power of Forgiveness. Do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Luke 6 verse 37. Resentment is like drinking poison and hoping that it will kill your enemies. Nelson Mandela. The power of forgiveness. In 1974, Cecilia and I had the honor and special treat of sitting under the teaching of Tante Corrie ten Boom, a Dutch lady in Amsterdam. The Nazis had imprisoned Corrie and her sister Betsy in February 1944 for sheltering Jews in their home. On her deathbed, Betsy famously told Corrie, "There is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still." Betsy died on the 16th of December 1944. Corrie was miraculously released from the Ravensbrück concentration camp 1 week before the entire group of women her age was exterminated. We were deeply touched by Corrie's ministry and her story of forgiveness. She told of how she was in Munich in 1947 speaking on forgiveness and was approached by a prison guard who had caused them so much pain and humiliation. He had since become a Christian and asked her to forgive him. She shared how she hesitated as all the painful memories came flooding back to her, and how she was able to draw on the grace of God and choose to forgive her former enemy. They grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. She shared how she had never known God's love so intensely as she did then. I've learned that you can't forgive anybody anything that they've done against you if you really want to. And not only can you forgive, you must forgive. If you don't, you will be trapped in the agonizingly more painful and restricting prison that results from bitterness and resentment. We all know the saying, patience is a virtue. That's because patience is a choice and not a feeling. The emotion of patience follows the deliberate act of the will to be patient and not the other way around. Like any virtue, forgiveness is a choice, not a feeling. If you wait until you feel like forgiving someone, you will wait a long time. As Corrie ten Boom affirms, forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Along with a reverential respect for God's holiness and an intrinsic hatred for sin and its consequences, an understanding of the power of forgiveness is another effective tool in my spiritual toolbox to assist me in living with a clear conscience. Imprisoned by resentment. In June 1978, Cecilia and I boarded a South African Airways flight in Buenos Aires for a flight to Cape Town. We had just completed a month of ministry in Argentina during the Mundial, the Football World Cup. We were handed newspapers with front-page news of 12 Elam missionaries who had been massacred in the Vumba Mountains in Zimbabwe. We read name after name and saw gruesome photographs of people we knew personally and had worked alongside. Among them, the picture of Joyce holding the hands of 3-year-old Pamela, both savagely beaten to death. The sheer brutality of the event shocked us to the core. We were in fact scheduled to be with him in another few weeks with an outreach team from South Africa. I reacted with bitterness, anger, and resentment in my heart. Emotionally and spiritually, it was one of the most unpleasant and longest flights home. People that I never knew had suddenly become my enemies. Back at the YWAM base, I went through the routine of preparing the YWAM team for our outreach to Zimbabwe, but I had no anointing or spiritual authority to do so. I remember publicly having to renounce my bitterness and resentment and declaring I was willing to forgive my friends' murderers, and if I should meet them, I wanted to be able to minister the love of God to them. Only then was I free to lead the team again spiritually and to prepare for our time of ministry in Zimbabwe. During the funeral service, Ron Chapman had prayed for the families of those who had been killed. He also prayed for those who were responsible for the killings. The theme at the funerals and the memorial services all over the UK was, Father, forgive them. Wow, what a powerful testimony. In the booklet Vumba, a summary of the tragedy published by the Elim International Mission Center, we read the following report. Rumors began to circulate in the early 1980s that several of the men personally responsible for the killings had been dramatically converted. Peter Griffiths was able to confirm the remarkable story of what happened to a group in the platoon who were together in an army camp shortly after the war had ended. 8 of them experienced a vision in which they saw the cross and the hand of God coming against them in judgment. 7 of them who had passports immediately left the country and enrolled in Bible schools in West and East Africa. The other, not having a passport, went to a Bible school in Harare. In another separate incident, an African pastor working for Harare intercessors was asked to speak at a rehabilitation center for ex-combatants. While he was preaching, a paraplegic man screamed out in agony out of deep conviction, crying for mercy. He later confessed that he had been one of those responsible for killing the missionaries. He had told the pastor how the missionaries had prayed for the killers as they were being slaughtered. I only became aware of these reports years after the incident. It confirmed the initial conviction in my heart to forgive perpetrators of the hideous atrocity and challenged me anew to guard my heart against bitterness and resentment. Mostly, though, I was filled with wonder and amazement at how the power and grace of God is released when we forgive those who do not know what they do. Falsely accused. April 26, 1994 was a historic day for the Republic of South Africa. It officially marked the end of apartheid and the end of the old South Africa. The next day ushered in a 3-day general election period in which there would be universal adult suffrage, citizens of all races being able to vote for the first time. That evening, the old South African flag, which had been in use since 1928, was lowered for the last time to make room for the new flag of the emerging Rainbow Nation to be hoisted in the morning. Instead of being in South Africa to witness this significant transition, I was in the neighboring country of Namibia. The next day I was to answer to false accusations in the High Court. I was irritated, to say the least, and resented the waste of these precious days of my time, especially during this momentous and pivotal season in my home country. A month before, I'd received notification from the registrar of the High Court in Namibia that the inquest into a murder was about to commence, and that YWAM in general and I in particular were implicated. The accusations referred to the assassination of advocate Anton Lebowski, an anti-apartheid activist and member of the South African People's Organization known as SWAPO. He was gunned down outside his house one evening by operatives of the Civil Cooperation Bureau in September 1989, more than 4 years earlier. I initially presumed I was implicated because one of the accused, an Irishman, had rented the YWAM guest facilities under the guise of being a journalist. However, after inquiring as to how we were implicated, I was sent the affidavit of a policeman who had attended a discipleship training school in Windhoek from June to December 1988, who was a co-accused in the murder. In a 5-page affidavit, he implicated me in the plot to assassinate Lebowski. He alleged that I was a commander in the South African Defence Force and that I posed to be a clergyman and that I trained people in espionage, information gathering and surveillance, and that the YWAM was involved in subversive activity. The irony of the matter was that I had not lived in Namibia since 1983 and only visited a few times a year. I had only spoken in the specific discipleship training school referred to for a few days on subjects like being real, integrity, humility, submission, self-worth, the Father heart of God, relinquishment of rights, being salt and light in the community. Initially, when This was brought to my attention. I thought it was a big joke. However, when the investigating officer asked me to submit an affidavit to answer the indictments, I realized that it wasn't such a laughing matter after all. I could submit an affidavit refuting the allegations and detailing my activities during the few days in question in Namibia, including flight numbers, titles of lectures, and so on. When I was later subpoenaed to appear in the High Court in Namibia within 3 days, I realized it was much more serious than I had anticipated. Both my integrity and the reputation of YWAM was at stake. I was frustrated as well as apprehensive and annoyed. In the dock. The 20 minutes or so in the dock were awkward, reasonably uncomfortable, slightly humiliating, and greatly humbling. There was also a moment of total panic offset by great relief. Immediately after my affidavit had been read and verified, I was expecting to be cross-examined about the alleged clandestine training I had given and my supposed identity as an army officer. I was caught off guard by questions from the judge's chair rather than from the attorney on the floor. I was also naive in terms of court procedures, calling the judge Your Honor instead of Your Lordship, to the amusement of my friends in the public gallery. The first question from the judge was related to my affiliation to the CCB. I told the judge that I could not even consciously remember what the CCB stood for, let alone being affiliated to them. He made a comment about my naivety. It was showing. The following few questions had to deal with politics, my personal and the mission's views on Marxism and communism and the conflict in Namibia. The court wanted to know if I, specifically, and the mission in general, were anti-communist. I assured the court that we were apolitical and not anti-anything but pro-Christ, and that we prayed for and worked for the peaceful solution in any conflict. At one stage, the cross-examination, the state prosecutor asked me how I remembered all the details of flight numbers and lectures, titles, and so on that I submitted in my affidavit. After all, the few days in question at the discipleship training school occurred almost 4.5 years earlier. I produced my 1988 journal and explained that I kept a meticulous account of my travels, speaking engagements, and corporate decisions for various reasons. Towards the end of the proceedings, he referred again to my 1988 diary and asked, "Can you tell the Honourable Court where you were on the 2nd of December 1988, the graduation day of the discipleship training school in question?" I nonchalantly grabbed my journal and turned to the said date. It was blank. I momentarily froze with fright. In fact, that journal was blank for a few days on either side of that date. In my panic, I turned to the year planner and saw that I'd booked out 1st to the 17th of December, USA and Hawaii International Strategy Conference. A moment of pure relief. I calmly passed that information on to the court. The court very quickly realized that the accusations against me were ludicrous and that both the policeman attending the discipleship training school and the Irish journalist had used YWAM as a front organization. I was released to return to South Africa to take care of important business. That was to cast my vote in the South African general elections the next day. The next morning, as I prepared for the flight home, I was surprised that I made the 8 o'clock news headlines with Nelson Mandela. The first report was Mandela's comment about the unprecedented elections starting later that day. The next report was of me refuting the allegations in the High Court, a small consolation after all the accusatory newspaper headlines of the previous few days. I felt a little exonerated and somewhat vindicated. The scant report of my innocence did not appear on the front page of the newspapers that day. But there was still an issue to be resolved. I had to deal with what I would have liked to call a slight reserve in my heart towards the persons who had wronged me, but let's call it what it is: resentment, bitterness, unforgiveness. I felt violated and betrayed. Trust had been broken. My integrity and the reputation of the mission had been tainted. I had to make a cold-blooded choice to forgive the individuals involved. Every time I review the incident, I must reinforce the choice once again. Even now, more than 20 years later, I keep reminding myself that forgiveness is a constant, ongoing attitude of the heart. In the spirit of openness, I must be honest. Although the principle of forgiveness has been established in my life, I still find it difficult to even contemplate having to trust again those who slandered my character in such a public way. Forgiveness and trust. I forgive primarily for my sake. Now, I know that sounds terribly selfish, but I believe it is also wise and intelligent. It is my personal policy to be quick to forgive for my sake. I don't want to be imprisoned by the irresponsible actions of others, and definitely not by the schemes of a fallen angel and a defeated enemy. To trust again takes time, though. Once trust has been violated, it takes time, sometimes a long time, to be reestablished. Rightly or wrongly, my personal policy is to be quick to forgive, but slow to trust. It has been our joy over many years to see people's lives restored by the ministry of Jesus from a place of shame and devastation to beauty and wholeness. It is particularly difficult for people who have been physically and emotionally abused, especially by those close to them, to come to the place of forgiveness. When we have encouraged such folk to forgive those who have hurt them, almost without exception, there's been a massive reluctance. The feeling has always been that if they forgive, they are condoning what the person did. They are saying it is okay. Our counsel has always been that abuse is never okay. You are not condoning or excusing what the person did by forgiving them, but what you are doing is setting yourself free from the prison of resentment and the bondage of bitterness so that God can start the restoration process. Imagine if someone stabbed me with a knife in my back. I would have one of two options. Either I could hurry to someone to remove the blade and disinfect the wound, the healing process can begin. Or I could back up into a wall and repeatedly bang the protruding knife deeper and deeper into my body. Just the thought probably makes you cringe, but we do that spiritually. We allow issues of the past to become festering wounds by indulging in bitterness, resentment, unforgiveness, and hatred. Allowing the person that you have forgiven access to you to keep on being abusive is another story. Be willing to forgive, but very careful to trust readily again. Trust needs to be earned. Justice and mercy. God is a compassionate God. He is a God of both justice and mercy. We also love both justice and mercy, but we want justice for others, especially our enemies, and mercy for ourselves. In 2002, I was driving through the morning rush hour traffic in the inner city of Pretoria when I witnessed a smash and grab. I was stationary at a red traffic light, second car from the front. I saw a young man walk nonchalantly across the road in front of us to the car in the right turning lane. Smash the passenger's window, grab the handbag off the front seat, run back across the road and disappear into a subway leading to a nearby station. The lights turned green and the traffic moved on as if nothing had happened. I drove up onto the sidewalk at the entrance to the subway and was getting out of my car to run after the thief when it dawned on me how stupid that was. I was about to leave my car with the keys still in the ignition, and the thief was probably waiting in the subway with a crowbar ready to bash my head in. I got back in the car, slightly shaken and very irritated that petty crime like that could go on unchecked. As I drove off, I replayed the incident in my head. I wish that God had allowed me to be the front car at the intersection rather than the second one. I could then have dropped my clutch and knocked the guy over, or at least pinned him up against the nearby wall with my car. As I drove through the city that day on various errands, I was especially vigilant at each intersection with the revs on the engine, kept intentionally hoping to find a criminal that I could take out at any moment's notice, or at the drop of a clutch. Fortunately, it never did happen. A few weeks later, our son John picked me up at the airport after I'd been away on a ministry trip. He related an incident that morning of an attempted theft on Cecilia's car in the driveway at our home. I felt the irritation, frustration, and anger rising in my heart. How dare that happen on my patch? Back home, Cecilia related the detail of the incident to me. She and Donovan had been out shopping and had intended to pay a utility bill, but had left the documents at home. They quickly went home, parked in the driveway, popped indoors for a quick drink, and collected the papers. On returning outside, they surprised a burglar who had already gained entrance to a car and was busy hot wiring it. The ignition lights were already on. Another minute or two later, and the car would have been gone. The thief's getaway was so hasty that he left a brand new pair of well-known name-brand trainers behind and made his retreat barefoot. Of course, I was grateful that Cecilia and the children hadn't been harmed and that the car hadn't been stolen, although it was damaged. But I was irritated and frustrated that it should even have taken place. I pray for protection of my family when I'm away. Why did it happen? I felt agitated, frustrated, and somewhat angry. The next morning, as I was dismantling the damaged ignition switch to replace it, I played through the incident in my mind. I wished it had happened while I was at home. I imagined myself detecting the thief in the car and sneaking around the other side of the house. As he saw me and was about to get out of the car, I would kick the door in, trapping him in with his neck in the door. I would then make a citizen's arrest and duly tie him up by his hands and his feet. I then imagined hanging him up by his feet from the tree in the front garden and calling the police with the hope that they would take hours to show up. Some of my friends would regard that as a very African vigilante approach to justice. You want justice for the handbag snatcher, didn't you? I heard the small voice of my conscience asking. Yes, yes, I retorted. What about the car thief? You want justice in that case as well, don't you? Yes, I thought. And if the police weren't going to do it, then I better do it. And what about you? Do you want justice for you? I felt a gentle but firm conviction of the Holy Spirit. I knew God had me backed in a corner. No, please, I pleaded. I need mercy. I wrestled with God. Why didn't He allow it to happen when I was home? Then I could have done something about it. Why did He allow it to happen at all? I felt God quietly convict me that it was because of my attitude. I didn't understand. I wasn't even home. I soon understood, though, that I'd made my family and myself vulnerable because I wanted to execute justice and not show mercy. And that is exactly the point. We want mercy for ourselves, but justice for those we deem as enemies. Why? Because we think that we are on the right side of justice. We forget that God has given us another chance and another chance and another chance, and that God has shown us mercy because justice has been served. It was served on Christ on our behalf and on behalf of all humanity, including our enemies. Now, I'm not suggesting that we condone crime, violence, and injustice, but we cannot respond to these things with a holier-than-thou attitude. In chapter 4 of the book of James, it is clear that we should not judge others because only God has the right to judge. In James 4 verse 12. The question is not whether we are right or wrong in our judgment, but who are we to judge in the first place? Only God knows the up-to-date details of every person's heart. Family inheritance. My father was the eldest of 4 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister. He always had hopes of inheriting the family farm as the firstborn. Years before my grandfather's death, he decided to apportion the inheritance, which I thought was very magnanimous of him. The problem was that my aunt inherited the farm and the sons each received a monetary inheritance equal to the value of the farm. My grandfather considered that as completely fair and just. Unfortunately, my dad reacted with bitterness and resentment. Although I was not privy to all that went on, it caused strained relationships in the family. I saw Dad stagnate spiritually and his health deteriorate. He was even starting to drink excessively. His excuse was that he was self-medicating because he couldn't sleep well. I tried to share my concerns with him and address the issue, but with seemingly very little effect. I was reminded that even Jesus could do no miracle in his hometown of Nazareth due to the people's familiarity and unbelief, and alluded to a prophet being without honor in his hometown, amongst his relatives and his own household. My dad has only called me long distance internationally twice in my life. The first time was to congratulate us at the news of our first child. The second time was a complete surprise. He told me that he had good news for me. My response was that it must be great news if he was calling me. He informed me that he had met with his brothers and sister and that they had resolved the issue of the inheritance. My grandfather already passed away, unfortunately. They had forgiven one another and were reconciled. He further shared with me that he felt like a new person. Many of the physical ailments that he had been suffering from disappeared almost overnight. Again, this confirmed to me the power of forgiveness and the detrimental effect of resentment, not only spiritually and psychologically, but also physically. Self-recrimination. If you're anything like me, there are probably some things you did or decisions you made that you wish you could undo, but you can't. I wish I could rewrite some of the chapters of my life, especially one related to my father in my teenage years, but I can't. That's water under the bridge. The clock cannot be turned back. We can easily become self-incriminating and even resentful and bitter towards ourselves for these incidents. Self-resentment imprisons us as much as unforgiveness towards others does. We need to take responsibility for the issues, embrace the grace of God, and forgive ourselves. How do we do that? By repenting of and turning away from the self-resentment and the self-blame involved. In Genesis, Joseph understood this principle and the tendency of human nature to resent or hate ourselves when we have done wrong. When he finally revealed himself to his brothers after they had sold him into slavery 22 years previously, he was quick to encourage them not to blame or resent themselves for what they had done, for God had used it for the good of them all. You can read that in Genesis 45, verse 5. On Sunday, the 27th of September 1981, Lauren and Darlene Cunningham flew into Windhoek, Namibia from Johannesburg to spend the day with us as a YWAM team. We arranged a special function where they could address the staff and students and friends of YWAM in the city. Having the visionary leaders of the mission with us was such a significant event that I summoned the YWAMers who were serving in remote areas of the country as teachers and nurses to join us for the weekend. On the Friday afternoon, Stephanie van der Poel had been serving as a teacher in Damaraland, was killed in a car accident on her way to the base. Mr. De Souza, the headmaster of the school where she was serving, called that evening to break the news to me. He relayed the circumstances of her death, that she had died instantly, that a passenger was seriously injured and died shortly afterwards, where her body and belongings were being kept, and what police station I needed to contact. My head was spinning. I immediately blamed myself. If I hadn't insisted that she come for the day with the Cunninghams, it would not have happened. It was my fault. I went through the motion of contacting her pastor in Cape Town and asked him to go to her parents' home and call me from there. I was then able to break the news to them and share my condolences with them while he could pray with them and support them. All the while, the sword of self-recrimination was hanging over my head. On the Sunday morning, I broke the news to the Cunninghams in the VW van in the airport car park. Lauren intuitively picked up my self-resentment and immediately started ministering to me. He encouraged me not to blame myself. We don't always need to understand these tragedies. We need to trust God in them. I remember us praying together that good would come out of it and being encouraged by the scripture, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. We had a great day with the Cunninghams despite the tragedy weighing heavily on our minds. On the Monday, I went to retrieve Stephanie's belongings and to arrange for her body to be flown to Cape Town. Amongst her stuff was a cassette tape neatly packaged and addressed, ready to be mailed to her parents. On the Thursday that week, I flew to Cape Town to be at the funeral. Her father, Stefan, a strapping big man, met me at the airport. I was deeply struck by his slumped shoulders and bloodshot eyes. He embraced me with a bear hug and thanked me profusely for all we had done for their daughter. I told him I was so happy to hear that, as I was concerned that he and his wife would blame me for recruiting her into missions and placing her in a remote place. He assured me that that was never in their minds and reprimanded me for even thinking so. Back at their home, I could share my condolences with Stephanie's mother and delivered her belongings, including the cassette tape. We decided to listen to the tape immediately. The tape was an oral journal recording the events over the past few weeks. At one stage, she told of the Cunninghams coming to visit Namibia and that I had requested she come to Windhoek for the weekend. She then added, "But I don't feel like going." Oh, that was like a dagger to my soul, reinforcing my self-blame. I should never have asked her to come. It was my fault. Stephanie continued to share the events that transpired over the next few days and then ended the tape on the evening of Thursday, the 24th of September 1981, by saying that she was going to travel the 450 kilometers to Windhoek the following afternoon to be with a YWAM event for the weekend. She felt God prompt her to go because he had a special appointment with her. She ended the recording by saying, "Goodbye, Mom and Dad. I'm excited to discover what my appointment with Jesus is this weekend." Her parents sobbed uncontrollably. I went to the bathroom in an emotional state, looked myself in the mirror, said something to the effect that I didn't understand the events of the last week, and released myself from the blame. It was not my fault. If Stephanie, one of our best missionaries, had run her race, finished her work on earth, and been ushered into heaven, who was I to argue? That evening, I met with their pastor to confirm the plans for the funeral the next day. He introduced me to his daughter, who had been living away from home in a rebellious state. On hearing of Stephanie's death, she immediately returned home, was reconciled with her parents, and recommitted her life to Christ. There was already fruit from the seed that had fallen into the ground. The next day, as I was walking out of church behind the coffin, a young lady, Stephanie's age, joined me. She shared how she and Stephanie had worked together in a kibbutz in Israel and had both felt called to missions. She felt that Stephanie had answered the call and had already finished her task, whereas she had not even responded yet. She asked if she could replace Stephanie. Within months, she was serving as a missionary teacher in Damaraland, Namibia. More fruit. And I'm sure there was a lot more. Forgiving God. I remember a young man being brought to me by a spiritual leader for prayer and advice regarding a problem he had with trusting God. He was known in the community for resenting God for having lost his dad when he was young. Often, when things went wrong in his life, instead of taking responsibility, he would blame it on losing his father when he was young. I didn't even bother to sit down for a long, drawn-out counseling and prayer session. I stood over him and said, "You don't need me to resolve this issue. You can do it yourself. All you need to do is forgive God." You could see the question mark form on his forehead. Forgive God, he questioned. I can't forgive God. God doesn't sin. Exactly, I replied. I could see the light come on into his eyes and the understanding dawn on him. God was not to blame. Now, technically, we can't forgive God, but we can deal with the resentment and bitterness in our hearts towards him by asking him to forgive us for resenting him. We often blame God for things he's not responsible for and are imprisoned by it. My mantra on forgiveness is simply this: you can and you must. If you don't, you won't. You can forgive anybody, anything they've done to you, if you really want to, because it is a choice and not a feeling. You not only can forgive, you must forgive, because if you don't, you won't be free. You'll be imprisoned by a defeated, fallen angel's schemes and someone else's indiscretion. Don't allow it to happen.